Throughout history, many great figures have left a profound impact on human civilization. From brilliant leaders and exceptional scientists to visionary thinkers, they have helped shape the world as we know it today.
The man known to history as Walter Henry Thompson was born on the 3rd of December 1890 to a working-class family in the suburb of Brixton in South London. His father was James Richard Thompson, who worked as an insurance agent, while his mother, Rebecca, ran a kiosk selling sweets while bringing up the family's 11 children. The young Walter went to Hackford Road Board School in the nearby district of Stockwell. He developed a strong sense of right and wrong at a young age when, after being hit by the boy who shared his desk, Thompson complained to the teacher, only to have the boy claim the opposite. Seething at the injustice, Walter refused to be caned, an all-too-common punishment used in schools at the time, and only accepted the punishment when threatened with expulsion. He later got his own back by beating up the boy outside of school hours. Growing up in an impoverished family, at the age of 8, Walter took a part-time job cleaning windows at a shop every morning before running 3 miles to get to school on time, which often caused him to fall asleep during class. At 14, he finished his formal schooling and started working as a telegraph messenger at the post office on St James's Street in the West End of London. After several years there, he found a new job as a stockkeeper at a shirt company in East London. An event in his young adult years resulted in Thompson's first interaction with Winston Churchill. On the 16th of December 1910, a gang of Jewish Latvian refugees in London who had fled anti-Semitic persecution in the Russian Empire had broken into a jeweller's shop before killing 3 policemen sent to arrest them. After their leader was killed during the gunfight, 2 of the Latvians took refuge at a house on Sydney Street in Stepney in East London. After receiving a tip-off about the hiding place, on the morning of the 3rd of January 1911, the Metropolitan Police began to besiege the house. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the police requested military support, and Churchill, who was serving as the Home Secretary at that time, sent a detachment of 21 Scots Guards to assist the police operation. Out of curiosity, Thompson went to Sydney Street and made his way to the front of the crowd of onlookers. Just before noon, Churchill himself arrived to observe proceedings. The shooting intensified, and the Home Secretary narrowly avoided being shot when a bullet flew through his top hat. By 1 in the afternoon, the building was on fire, and Churchill instructed the fire brigade to allow the house to burn. An hour and a half later, the shooting stopped, and the bodies of the 2 men within were recovered. As he witnessed the Home Secretary's brush with destiny, Thompson could not have known that a decade later he would be responsible for Churchill's personal security. At 36, Churchill was one of the rising stars of British politics. The grandson of the 7th Duke of Marlborough and the son of the late Lord Randolph Churchill, one of the leading figures in the Conservative Party towards the end of the 19th century, Winston Churchill had served as both a soldier and journalist in the 1890s and early 1900s in Cuba, India, Sudan, and in South Africa during the Second Boer War, before being elected to the House of Commons as a Conservative Member of Parliament in 1901. After crossing the aisle to join the Liberal Party in 1904, Churchill was appointed President of the Board of Trade by the new Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith. Working closely with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, Churchill introduced a series of social reforms, including an 8-hour workday for miners, a minimum wage for low-paid workers, and the creation of labour exchanges for the unemployed to find work. Yet, while he introduced workers' reforms, Churchill was also known for opposing the unions and strike movements, and for many years before he began working for him, Thompson was critical of the Home Secretary on account of his own working-class background. By the time of the siege of Sydney Street, Thompson was engaged to Kate Beale, the daughter of a cabinet maker whose family lived in Leighton in East London, whom he would marry later in 1911. A keen football player, he played as an amateur for Clapton Orient, the club now known as Leyton Orient. He was scouted by Arsenal and offered a professional contract, but was forced to turn it down when his mother disapproved. At around this time, Thompson was walking through the market when he witnessed a man trying to attack a policeman with a wooden plank. After helping the policeman wrestle the assailant to the ground until reinforcements arrived, he was invited to the police station a few days later and given a silver pocket watch as a reward for his gallantry. Thereafter, Thompson became a volunteer police officer in Leighton and took some night classes to improve his literacy with a view to becoming a professional police officer, encouraged to do so by a police sergeant who lived next door to the Beales. On the 9th of October 1911, Thompson joined the Metropolitan Police, based in Paddington Green Police Station on Edgware Road in West London, from where he would patrol the beat in the leafy area of Bayswater. In the spring of 1913, Constable Thompson was informed by a senior officer that there were 13 vacancies for detectives in the Special Branch, the unit of the Metropolitan Police responsible for investigating politically sensitive issues, which was then being expanded to deal with the wave of political protests and social disruption instigated by the suffragettes, the women's rights organisation led by Emmeline Pankhurst, who were campaigning aggressively for women to be given the right to vote in the United Kingdom. Thompson went to the headquarters of the Met at Scotland Yard to sit the exam and was duly admitted. As a detective, he was involved in tracking the movements of the suffragettes from their headquarters in Kingsway in central London. Thompson got to know the Pankhursts and the other suffragette leaders during this period and found it distasteful when many were arrested in the mid-1910s and were subjected to force-feeding in prison after going on hunger strike. Aside from trailing suffragettes, Thompson was involved in tracking down anarchists and communists during this period. In late 1913, as diplomatic tensions were increasing throughout Europe in advance of the outbreak of the First World War, Special Branch was closely tracking the activities of suspected German spies in Britain. When war finally did break out in the late summer of 1914, Thompson was involved in the roundup of almost 500 suspected German agents across the country. It was also in this context that he finally began working as a bodyguard for Churchill, who, by then, was serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, the governmental head of the British Royal Navy. In early 1915, Thompson was assigned to Churchill's protection detail. That day, Thompson accompanied Churchill to Horse Guards Parade next door to the Admiralty as he witnessed a demonstration of vehicles on caterpillar tracks climbing over small mounds of earth, which he later realized had been an experiment in the development of the first British tanks. The posting as Churchill's bodyguard was only temporary at this juncture, and following the assignment, Thompson returned to his normal duties. The First World War came to an end in November 1918. In the months that followed, Thompson was assigned to Churchill's protection detail on a number of occasions, who who by then was the Secretary of State for War, charged primarily with demobilizing the hundreds of thousands of British soldiers and army staff still present in France. Thompson was also often assigned as a bodyguard to the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. It was a particularly dangerous time for British political leaders, as a guerrilla war had broken out in Ireland, where Catholic nationalists aimed to end British rule after hundreds of years. The Irish Republican Army, or IRA, was not above attempting to assassinate Lloyd George, and senior members of the British government and bodyguards like Thompson were in high demand. Thompson, though, was unimpressed by Lloyd George's frequent affairs and asked to be relieved of his duties within a few months. As a result, in February 1921, he was reassigned to be Churchill's personal bodyguard. Churchill having become a primary target for assassination by the IRA, as he had established the Black and Tans, a hated paramilitary force which was notorious for the atrocities it committed in Ireland. After an initial 2-week probationary period in this role, Churchill asked Thompson to be by his side permanently. Thompson would go on to shadow Churchill for 2 stints, which would account for almost 18 years of his life. Churchill's subsequent position as Secretary of the Colonies gave him responsibility for the Middle East in the early 1920s. The region had been under the control of the Turkish Ottoman Empire since the 16th century, but Ottoman defeat in the First World War saw the region occupied by the British and French. Britain was responsible for Palestine, Transjordan, and Mesopotamia, with the French in the Lebanon and Syria. However, many Arab groups were agitating for independence, and the Jewish people were also calling for their own nation-state in the Levant. In an effort to resolve these tensions, Churchill convened a conference in Cairo in Egypt in March 1921. Thompson accompanied him to North Africa. As his advisor on Middle Eastern affairs, Churchill had brought with him T.E. Lawrence, who had played a significant role during the war in galvanizing Arab opposition to the Ottomans. Lawrence informed Thompson that Churchill's life would be endangered throughout the trip, but that his job would be made easier by the support of the Egyptian police under Sir Thomas Russell, known in Egypt as Russell Pasha. Churchill had a tendency to put his life in danger even without the help of potential assassins, and on a trip to the pyramids of Saqqara, Thompson was aghast when Churchill fell off his camel. During the conference, Churchill paid a visit to King Fuad of Egypt at the Abdin Palace in Cairo. Thompson was forced to cede his place next to Churchill to Field Marshal Viscount Edmund Allenby, British High Commissioner in Egypt and the commander of British forces in the Middle East during the First World War. Thompson was riding in the second car with a sergeant of the Royal Air Force when a mob descended on the British party. Though Churchill and Allenby managed to get through, the palace sentries closed the gates on Thompson's car, which was soon attacked by the mob. Consequently, Thompson and the sergeant had to beat back the mob with their fists, forcing the protesters to withdraw. Thereafter, Thompson and Churchill prepared to depart for Jerusalem by train. Thompson was informed of potential threats to the colonial secretary in Gaza. When the train pulled into the Palestinian city, a restless crowd of roughly 2,000 people had gathered. As the mounted police clashed with the crowd, an anxious Churchill asked Lawrence what was happening. Thompson witnessed Lawrence's authority among the Arabs when all he had to do was wave his hand and say a few words in Arabic before the crowd moved aside and cheered heartily for Churchill. Although Churchill and the British government were unable to find a solution to the Palestine issue, the Cairo Conference resulted in the creation of the Emirate of Transjordan on the east bank of the Jordan River, headed by Abdullah bin Hussein, whose brother Faisal became king of Iraq, a new kingdom carved out of Mesopotamia. Back in Britain, Churchill's attention returned to Ireland. Faced with increased threats from the IRA, Churchill invited Thompson to his house in Sussex Square, north of Hyde Park, and showed him the security precautions he had taken in his bedroom, including a steel-plated chair between the bed and the door which concealed a .45 Colt pistol. Thompson would spend his nights sleeping with his junior officer in a nearby room. Although Churchill had long believed that it was necessary to defeat the IRA completely before any negotiations could begin, by the summer of 1921, he and Lloyd George realized this was unrealistic and offered peace talks to the Irish Republicans. Eamon de Valera, the president of Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, asked Arthur Griffith and IRA commander Michael Collins to lead the Irish negotiating team in London. When Sir James Craig, the leader of the Unionists in Northern Ireland, protested at the prospect of Irish independence, Churchill asked Thompson to arrange for the two men to be conducted into the Colonial Office via separate entrances before leaving them alone and locking the doors. The half-hour meeting between the two opponents enabled negotiations to carry on. On the 6th of December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, leading to the partition of Ireland. 6 Protestant-majority counties in the north would remain part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, while the 26 counties in the south would form the Irish Free State, an independent nation within the British Empire. Though he had hoped for full independence, Collins signed the treaty to avoid further bloodshed, but de Valera repudiated the agreement, and within weeks, Ireland descended into a bloody civil war between the pro-treaty Free Staters and the anti-treaty Republicans. In October 1922, a group of Conservative junior ministers staged a rebellion which resulted in the Conservatives withdrawing support from the coalition government that Lloyd George had led since 1916. Churchill lost his government offices while the Conservative leader, Andrew Bonar-Law, became the new Prime Minister and called new elections. Since May 1908, Churchill had represented the safe Liberal seat of Dundee in Parliament and stood for re-election in the November general election. As Churchill had just had his appendix removed, Thompson was required to carry his political master up the stairs, a feat which was still possible at that juncture as Churchill was only beginning to gain the extensive amount of weight which characterized his girth in later years. After Churchill was defeated by a Scottish prohibitionist candidate, he quipped that he was now without a seat, without a party, without an office, and without an appendix. Nevertheless, Churchill retained his bodyguard, and when he left for Cannes in southern France for a 5-month holiday, Thompson was obliged to join him, leaving his wife Kate and their 3 sons and 1 daughter at home in Westcliff-on-Sea in Essex. Bonar-Law stepped down as Prime Minister in May 1923 with terminal throat cancer and died at the end of October. When his successor, Stanley Baldwin, called an election in December, Churchill stood as a Liberal candidate in Leicester but was defeated by the Labour Party. With the support of the Liberals, Labour leader Ramsay MacDonald now formed a minority government. Disgusted that the Liberals had allowed a socialist government to come to power, Churchill stood as an independent anti-socialist candidate in the Westminster Abbey by-election of March 1924. On the eve of polling day, Churchill's car was attacked by a mob, and Thompson was once again obliged to use his boxing skills to hold back the assailants. At the election count, Churchill was defeated by the Conservative candidate by a narrow margin of 43 votes. However, when MacDonald's minority government collapsed in October 1924, Churchill stood as the Conservative candidate in Epping in Essex and returned to Parliament. Baldwin duly appointed him Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man responsible for the nation's finances. Churchill's budget of 1925 returned Britain to the gold standard, reducing liquidity in the economy, leading to deflation and a spike in unemployment. Shortly afterwards, the unions declared a general strike in May 1926 and led to a spike in fractious crowds surrounding Churchill when he travelled around Westminster and London. Thompson organised security and accompanied Churchill for 19 hours every day as he split his time between the Treasury and other duties. Eventually, he negotiated with the unions, and the general strike was called off. In the late 1920s, when Churchill was not busy with his political duties, he was supervising building work at Chartwell, his country house in Kent. After Churchill developed a hobby of bricklaying, Thompson mixed the mortar for him. One day, when Churchill was experimenting with the water features in the garden, he fell into the mud of a lake bed that was not yet dry, and Thompson hurried over to pull him out. Thompson brought his family to Chartwell each summer, and Churchill grew fond of the children. Around 1929, when Thompson's 8-year-old daughter Grace fell ill and risked losing her hearing, Churchill arranged for her to see a specialist and paid the medical bills. All of this indicates that while Thompson worked for Churchill, there was also a growing friendship between the pair, despite their vastly different backgrounds in an age when social class was a major component of British life. In the general election of May 1929, the Conservative government was defeated and Labour took power for a second time. As he was no longer in office, Churchill's protection was withdrawn, and Thompson now returned to tracking down political extremists with the police. In January 1931, Churchill resigned from the Shadow Cabinet in protest against Baldwin's support of Labour's policy to grant India dominion status within the British Empire. Churchill's belief that the Indians were not ready for self-government led to new threats on his life from Indian nationalists. This was shortly before he was to leave for a lecture tour in the United States, through which he aimed to recoup significant amounts of money which he had lost as a result of the Wall Street crash of 1929, and Churchill arranged for Thompson to be back by his side for the trip. On the 13th of December 1931, after being unable to sleep on the train the previous night, Thompson agreed to remain at his New York hotel while Churchill went to dinner with a banker. Unsure of the address, Churchill got out of his cab and began to cross the road. Forgetting that Americans drove on the right-hand side, he was hit by a car and taken to hospital with serious injuries. A guilt-ridden Thompson hurried to the hospital, where he restricted access to the patient and fended off inquiries from the British and American press. After Churchill was released, Thompson accompanied him to the Bahamas to help his recovery before the pair returned to the United States to complete the rescheduled lecture tour. After a lecture in Chicago, Churchill was in the entrance hall when Thompson saw an Indian nationalist rushing at Churchill with a hand in his pocket. Thompson pulled out his gun and sent the Indian crashing into the glass door. In August 1931, as Ramsay MacDonald's Labour administration struggled to deal with the global depression, King George V asked MacDonald to form a national government with the Conservatives and Liberals. When Thompson returned to Britain in March 1932 after the end of Churchill's tour, He briefly served as the protection officer for James Henry Thomas, the Labour Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs. Thompson enjoyed working for Thomas, who was a fanatic about sports, but upon his promotion to detective inspector in 1935, he began protecting foreign dignitaries such as Crown Prince Saud of Arabia and Prince Paul of Yugoslavia during state visits to England. However, shortly thereafter, Thompson retired as a policeman. He was only in his mid-40s, but he was seeking to rebuild his family life, which had been greatly damaged by his long hours and lengthy absences from England altogether since the early 1920s. Nevertheless, Thompson struggled to adjust to life after leaving the police force, spending the next 2 years inspecting garages for the Motor Trade Association and running several businesses. He remained in contact with Churchill, whose prospects of returning to government appeared rather slim, even after Baldwin returned as Prime Minister in June 1935. Churchill was a part of a small minority of British politicians who warned of the threat from Adolf Hitler's Germany and German rearmament after the Nazis came to power there in 1933. They are often termed Churchill's wilderness years, owing to his declining political fortunes. In late 1938, Thompson published his first memoir, Guard from the Yard, describing his work protecting Churchill and other political dignitaries. When he visited Churchill at Chartwell in April 1939, the latter predicted that Britain and Germany would be at war within 6 months. Hitler had just invaded Czechoslovakia a few weeks earlier, breaking a promise he had made to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain the previous autumn, and Germany now seemed poised to invade Poland. On the 22nd of August 1939, Thompson was surprised to receive a telegram from Churchill summoning him to Croydon Aerodrome at 4:30 p.m. the following day. While visiting the south of France, Churchill had been informed by French intelligence he was a target for Nazi snipers. After meeting Thompson, Churchill offered him £5 a week to serve as his personal bodyguard, an arrangement that was formalized by the Metropolitan Police within days. The same day, Germany agreed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, one which gave Hitler a free hand to launch his invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Churchill did not yet have a ministerial job when Germany invaded Poland, but when Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, he returned to his old job as First Lord of the Admiralty. Although Britain and France had gone to war in response to the invasion of Poland, there was little either could do to prevent Poland's occupation by Germany and the Soviet Union. Thompson accompanied Churchill to France, where the latter inspected the Maginot Line, the imposing network of defences on France's eastern frontier with Germany. Churchill warned that the Germans might seek to bypass the Maginot Line, but the French dismissed these concerns. On the morning of the 10th of May 1940, the German military machine rolled into Belgium and the Netherlands in preparation for an invasion of France, as Churchill had predicted. That same day, Chamberlain resigned from the premiership, and Churchill succeeded him as Prime Minister at the age of 66. After forming a national government with Labour and the Liberals, he told the House of Commons on the 13th of May, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." As Churchill's soaring rhetoric rallied the nation in its darkest hour, Thompson was often present as Churchill dictated his early drafts, which were typed up by his secretaries Kathleen Hill and Mary Shearburn. Thompson was often based in Shearburn's office, and the pair formed a close friendship. Though he was still married to his wife, Kate, she and Walter were effectively separated, and he had already been in a romantic relationship with Marjorie Wigley before the war. By 1940, Thompson and Sherburne were going to movies and football matches together, the beginning of a long relationship. Following the German invasion of France, the British Expeditionary Force had been sent across the Channel, but French resistance had crumbled, and by the end of the month, Churchill ordered the evacuation of all British units from the port of Dunkirk in northern France. The Prime Minister flew to France on 6 occasions, seeking to persuade the French government to continue the fight. On the 13th of June, after Churchill encouraged his French counterpart Paul Reynaud not to surrender, the latter's mistress attempted to attack Churchill but was intercepted by Thompson. On their return flight to England, a German Heinkel dive bomber suddenly appeared, forcing the civilian pilot to dive into the sea mist to escape the clutches of the German aircraft. Despite these hazardous efforts by Churchill, the newly appointed French Prime Minister, the First World War hero Marshal Philippe Pétain, surrendered on the 25th of June. As the British government began efforts to capture parts of the French fleet in the Atlantic and Mediterranean to prevent it falling into Nazi hands, Thompson feared that attacks on Churchill would increase, potentially fueled by French exiles arriving in London. Churchill's life was further endangered from the autumn of 1940 onwards as the German aerial bombardment of London, in an effort to force the British into surrendering, commenced. As German bombs rained down on London, Churchill was persuaded by Thompson and others to vacate his residence at No. 10 Downing Street and moved to an abandoned tube station, while the cabinet war rooms were being built under the government offices in Whitehall. Despite these precautions, Churchill often displayed his courage and lack of concern for personal safety by retreating underground only after bombers were flying overhead and the British anti-aircraft batteries had opened fire. Thompson's efforts to encourage his political master to take greater consideration of his safety were often disregarded, leading to many disagreements between the two men, which were usually patched up rapidly. Churchill often hinted to Thompson that he was subject to some form of divine protection, but this supernatural justification did little to calm the anxieties of the policeman. There were many close calls. On one occasion, a shell from an anti-aircraft gun exploded near the entrance of the underground shelter. Thompson bundled Churchill back inside to prevent the Prime Minister from being struck by shrapnel. When the intensity of the German bombing campaign dropped off in June 1941, he began to spend his weekends at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat in Buckinghamshire. Thompson feared that the vast wooded grounds could hide German paratroopers and arranged for 200 soldiers to be posted as guards while an air raid shelter was built underground. Ever since he became Prime Minister, Churchill sought to enlist the support of President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States. Although Roosevelt had been elected to an unprecedented third presidential term in the November 1940 presidential elections, after promising to stay out of the war, in March 1941, the U.S. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, providing armaments to Britain in return for leases on naval and air bases. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Churchill hoped that Roosevelt would increase his support for the Allied war effort. In August 1941, Thompson accompanied Churchill to meet Roosevelt in Newfoundland. On the 14th of August, the two leaders made a joint declaration known as the Atlantic Charter, setting out a joint vision for the post-war world, while Roosevelt agreed to protect commercial shipping in the Atlantic as far as Iceland. When Churchill introduced Roosevelt to his bodyguard, the American president told Thompson, Take care of him. He is about the greatest man in the world. In fact, he may very likely be the greatest. You have a terrible responsibility of safeguarding him." Though the United States did not enter the war at that juncture, it eventually did so following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was accompanied by a massive assault on British imperial possessions in Southeast Asia, prompting Churchill to return to North America to coordinate the war effort against Germany and Japan with Roosevelt. While the Pacific theater of the war was concerning, Churchill was aware that the European front against the Nazis was the main priority and obtained Roosevelt's agreement to focus on the war against Germany. Churchill was joined by the British military chiefs, who agreed to form a combined military staff with the Americans based in Washington. On the 14th of January 1942, Churchill returned home from Bermuda aboard the flying boat Berwick. Thompson had been anxious to join the Prime Minister on the return trip, but Churchill was accompanied by the military chiefs and Walter was left behind. Thompson was right to be concerned about Churchill's safety. Not only did the pilot lose his way and narrowly avoided entering the range of German anti-aircraft guns near the coast of France, but British radar identified the aircraft as an enemy bomber and scrambled fighters to shoot it down. The Prime Minister and the Army's top brass only avoided becoming victims of friendly fire due to cloud cover. By the summer of 1942, Japanese forces had overrun British defences in Malaya, Singapore and Burma, while in North Africa, the Germans captured Tobruk in Libya on the 21st of June. These developments initiated a period of extensive travel for Churchill, during which he was accompanied by Thompson on nearly all occasions, who managed much of the British war leader's security arrangements. Destinations included the US in June, Cairo in August, and Moscow thereafter for Churchill's first meeting with Stalin. During the latter trip, Thompson warned Churchill of the possibility that Russian agents were listening to their conversations in their guest quarters. The night before leaving Moscow, Thompson accompanied Churchill to a one-on-one meeting with Stalin, where he was obliged to wait for 8 hours before the two leaders ended their meeting at 2 in the morning. On the way back to England, Churchill insisted on another visit to the North Africa front, where Thompson had to ask Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg to instruct Churchill to remain behind the front lines. By the beginning of November, General Montgomery won the Third Battle of El Alamein there, decisively turning the North Africa campaign in the Allies' favour. While the British and Americans were converging on General Erwin Rommel in Libya, further to the west, Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca in Morocco between the 14th and 24th of January 1943, where the Allies declared their determination to continue fighting the war until the Axis powers of Germany, Italy and Japan surrendered unconditionally. During one of his breaks from proceedings to take a walk to the sea, Churchill attempted to return to the village where proceedings were being held by an alternative route. After finding the way blocked by barbed wire, Churchill climbed over the obstacles with Thompson close behind. An American sentry threatened to fire, and Roosevelt later rebuked a shamefaced Churchill for his attempt to breach the defences of the compound. Before returning to England, Churchill visited the Libyan capital, Tripoli, which had been captured by the 8th Army days earlier. As he prepared to return to England on the night of the 5th of February, one of the 4 engines on his plane developed a fault. Thompson claimed later that he had advised Churchill to wait until the issue was fixed, but 3 years later, an American captain claimed in his memoirs that one of Churchill's detectives deliberately sabotaged the plane, an accusation which Thompson, who was the only detective with Churchill that night, vehemently denied. According to Walter's eldest son, Harold, his father was indeed responsible for the sabotage. According to Thompson's biographer, Tom Hickman, the most plausible explanation is that Churchill had received intelligence from decrypted German communications indicating an attack on Churchill's plane. The British had recently broken the Enigma code, which the Germans considered invulnerable, and did not want the Germans to find out about the breach. By instructing Thompson to tamper with the aircraft, Churchill prevented the plane from taking off without the Germans suspecting that their code had been cracked. In early March 1943, Thompson accidentally shot himself in the left leg after receiving a call to accompany Churchill to Chequers. Thompson's 3 sons, Harold, Harvey and Fred, were all serving in the Royal Air Force and obtained leave to visit their father in hospital. As he continued his recovery at Hove on the south coast, Thompson received a telegram informing him that his son, Fred, was missing after operations on the night of the 11th of March, and on the 2nd of April, Fred's death was confirmed. In an age of stoic emotions, Thompson grieved by speaking little of the event. He returned to work shortly afterwards, joining Churchill on a commercial liner to Washington, D.C. for a further conference there. During the crossing, acknowledging the risk of German submarine activity and the possibility that he might be captured, Churchill told Thompson that his Colt pistol was fully loaded and he would fire every bullet in defense, leaving the last for himself. In June 1943, Thompson was awarded the British Empire Medal by King George VI. When the King remarked, "You must have a difficult time guarding the Prime Minister," Thompson replied, "Yes, Your Majesty. Unfortunately, he will not do what he is told for his own safety." To which the King responded, "That is just what I find." A couple of months later, Thompson was back in North America alongside his charge for the Quebec Conference. In the midst of tense negotiations, Thompson joined Churchill and Roosevelt on a fishing trip, where he capsized his canoe after getting caught in the weeds, prompting the Prime Minister to shout, "What are you trying to do, Thompson? Commit suicide?" At Quebec, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to a joint conference with Stalin at the end of November in the Iranian capital of Tehran. Upon arrival in Tehran, Thompson was appalled at the security arrangements and told the Iranian authorities that the army and police should be facing the crowds and looking out for danger rather than turning to salute the leaders. While the suggestions were initially dismissed, that evening Churchill informed Thompson that an unknown number of German paratroopers had dropped near Tehran to carry out Operation Long Jump, an attempt to assassinate the Allied leaders planned by the notorious SS officer Otto Skorzeny. To reduce the risk, Roosevelt stayed at a dacha in the grounds of the Soviet embassy, while Thompson ensured that the small distance between the British and Soviet embassies was cleared of the hostile crowds that were being stirred up by German agitators. On the 29th of November, the second day of the conference, Churchill presented Stalin with the Sword of Stalingrad, a gift from King George on behalf of the British people to recognize the sacrifice of the Soviet people at the victory of Stalingrad in early 1943, which turned the course of the war on the Eastern Front in the Soviets' favor. Thompson carried the sword in its case and placed it on a table before Churchill gave the sword to Stalin. Despite this gesture, Churchill was irritated that Roosevelt seemed too willing to make concessions to Stalin, supporting the partitioning of Germany after the war and resisting Churchill's plans to expand the war to the Balkans in southeastern Europe. On the 1st of December, the final day of the conference, Allied intelligence officers disabled 6 German operatives planning to assassinate the 3 leaders. Taking no chances, as Churchill was leaving for the airport the following morning, Thompson had the Prime Minister travel in an army truck, while his staff rode in his limousine. Thompson disliked the ordeal of constantly accompanying Churchill to conference after conference, and the Prime Minister, who had just celebrated his 69th birthday on the 30th of November, frequently suffered from pneumonia. In the early hours of the morning of the 12th of December, after Churchill arrived at Tunisia to meet the Allied commanders, Thompson noticed that the Prime Minister had stopped breathing and entered Churchill's bedroom. The 2005 television series, Churchill's Bodyguard, speculates that Thompson performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to save Churchill's life, but Thompson states in his memoirs that he only placed his head close to Churchill's pillow and was relieved to hear him breathing quietly. Churchill's physician, Lord Moran, suspected that he had suffered a small heart attack, but against all odds, Churchill improved and was soon back at work deciding what to do about Italy. Although the Italian government had switched sides in September 1943, the Germans supported a puppet regime under Mussolini in northern Italy and established a strong defensive position at the monastery of Monte Cassino, south of Rome. As he gradually regained his strength, Churchill agreed to spend Christmas at Marrakesh in Morocco. Thompson was terrified when Churchill requested and was given temporary control of the aircraft on the way. In Marrakesh, Churchill took the opportunity to improve relations with General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France, the government in exile in opposition to Pétain's puppet regime. By the time Churchill returned to Britain in January 1944, he set off supervising preparations for the invasion of France in southern England. On a visit to Eisenhower's headquarters on the 3rd of June, Churchill declared his intention to accompany the invasion force. Knowing Churchill's disdain for physical danger, Thompson was not surprised. Eisenhower vehemently refused, and the following day, King George informed Churchill that if the Prime Minister was so intent on joining the invasion, then the King would join him, forcing Churchill to give in. The operation had been due to go ahead on the 5th of June, but bad weather postponed the invasion to the 6th of June, D-Day. After landing in Normandy, Allied troops broke through the German defences, and a week later, Churchill and Thompson sailed to France. Upon arriving on French shores, Thompson was ordered to remain on the beach for 7 hours while Churchill was taken to Montgomery's headquarters. In mid-June, soon after their return to England, Hitler began sending V-1 missiles to London, known as doodlebugs, in retaliation for Allied bombing raids on Germany. As he had done during the London Blitz in 1940 and 1941, Churchill responded with curiosity rather than fear. Thompson took steps to prevent Churchill from fulfilling his desire to see a doodlebug in action, knowing that such a device could explode at any moment, killing himself and the Prime Minister. In September, liquid-fueled V-2 rockets, the first ever types of modern rockets which had been developed by German engineers between 1939 and 1944, began landing on London. During the final year of the war, Thompson accompanied Churchill on a whirlwind tour to various conferences and meetings to work out the post-war world order now that Germany's defeat was all but assured. In September 1944, Churchill met Roosevelt in Quebec in Canada. The following month, he was in Moscow to meet Stalin, where the two men agreed to a division of influence in the Balkans between the Soviets and the Western Allies. And on the 11th of November, Churchill joined de Gaulle in recently liberated Paris to commemorate Armistice Day, when the First World War had come to an end in 1918. Thompson was an ever-present figure by Churchill's side during these trips. Though Thompson was worried about the impact of Churchill's intensive schedule on his health, the Prime Minister carried on. Aged 55, Thompson's own mental and physical health was not in the best condition either. Over the course of 5 years, Thompson had travelled 200,000 miles around the world with Churchill. He later recalled that he spent more time around the Prime Minister than any other human being during the war, a fact that irritated Churchill's wife, Clementine, who had learned that Thompson was having an affair with Mary Shearburn. Clementine asked her husband to dismiss Walter, but Churchill adamantly refused to be separated from his loyal bodyguard and had instead asked Shearburn to leave his secretariat in the summer of 1942. Thompson had attempted to reconcile with his wife, Kate, during the war, but ultimately the marriage had broken down irrevocably, and when Thompson was in hospital in March 1943, neither his wife nor her 2 daughters, Grace and Kathleen, came to visit. All of these developments, travelling, the personal instability and personal grief, took their toll. By the autumn of 1944, still grieving from his son Fred's death and struggling to cope with Churchill's intense schedule, Thompson suffered a quasi-mental breakdown and was forced to spend 5 weeks in Hove to restore his health. In February 1945, by then back at work protecting the Prime Minister, Thompson accompanied Churchill to the Yalta Conference in Crimea, the final occasion on which the 3 wartime leaders would meet. Stalin insisted that Poland would be under a communist provisional government, but agreed to free elections in Poland and other Soviet-occupied territories, a promise he had no intention of keeping. Following the Yalta meeting, Churchill made another quick visit to Greece before seeing Roosevelt, who was terminally ill and would be dead before long, for the final time in Egypt, and meeting with 5 Middle Eastern heads of state who belatedly joined the war on the Allied side. Although the Allied advance in Europe had stalled in late 1944, by February 1945, Field Marshal Montgomery's troops were on the banks of the Rhine. Churchill was determined to set foot on German soil, and Thompson was again appalled when Montgomery allowed the Prime Minister to cross over in a landing craft. This was the last time Churchill visited the front during the war, much to Thompson's relief, who was keen for the war to be over as soon as possible, especially as with the final collapse of his first marriage, he had married Mary Shearburn secretly on the 15th of February 1945 and was anxious to have some sort of break to spend with his new wife. On the 12th of April, Thompson was informed of Roosevelt's death by Churchill, who said, "I have lost a great friend. Now we have to start all over again." On account of the Prime Minister's grief that day, Thompson accompanied him late into the night until Churchill could get some sleep. Churchill was much happier at the end of the month when he heard of Mussolini and Hitler's deaths. On the 1st of May, Berlin had fallen to Soviet troops. After the Germans surrendered unconditionally on the 7th of May, Churchill made the official announcement the following afternoon. Thompson arranged for increased protection as Churchill made his way past the cheering crowds from Downing Street in an open-top car to make a statement to the House of Commons. While Churchill was leaving the Commons on the way to an audience with the King at Buckingham Palace, Thompson discovered that he had forgotten to bring along the case of spare cigars that he routinely carried with him, and Churchill asked to go back to collect it before meeting the King. That evening, after Thompson had sent away the open-top car, Churchill sought to go out amongst the crowds again and decided to do so on foot. As they struggled to move through the thick mass of people and vehicles, Thompson helped Churchill climb onto the roof of a car blocking their path, which was met with enthusiastic cheering from the onlookers. Although the war in Japan was not yet over, victory in Europe encouraged the Labour Party to withdraw from the national government, and an election was called for the 5th of July, with results announced later in the month to account for ballots cast by servicemen overseas. At the beginning of June, Thompson informed Churchill that after a health examination he would soon be withdrawn from Churchill's protection. Detective Inspector Lumsden Hughes, who had stood in for Thompson while the latter was recovering from his mental breakdown, was to assume Thompson's duties. As Churchill prepared to go to a final wartime conference with Stalin and US President Harry Truman in Potsdam, Thompson briefed the Royal Marine Guards assigned to the protection of the British delegation. On the 30th of June, Thompson finally relinquished his duties as Churchill's bodyguard. As the two men bid farewell to each other, the Prime Minister said, "Goodbye, Thompson. You can come and see me anytime, anywhere." Upon taking his leave, Thompson informed Churchill of his marriage to Sherburne, and Churchill gave him a substantial cheque as a wedding present. Churchill had gone to Potsdam expecting to return to office, but when the election results came in 4 weeks later, the Conservatives were defeated. Although Thompson had informed Churchill that he was being retired due to health issues, another factor that led to the end of the working relationship was the fact that Thompson was seeking to publish his memoirs about his wartime experiences by Churchill's side based on the diary he kept. Although Scotland Yard had agreed to its publication conditional on Churchill's approval, the latter was unwilling to support the publication of a book that contained many details of his private life. Thompson had, therefore, requested to leave the service in early June, hoping that it would remove an obstacle to publication. After taking his leave from Churchill, Thompson moved to a small bungalow he had bought before the war at Greatstone near the Kent coast. Although he was saddened to hear that Churchill had lost office in the July election, he hoped that this would make it easier for his book to be published, and wrote to Churchill seeking his permission to do so. He was disappointed to receive no response, while Churchill put pressure on the Metropolitan Police to threaten to withdraw Thompson's pension if he were to go ahead with publication, afraid of what the book might reveal about him. In order to supplement his pension of just over £350 a year, Thompson became a rent collector for New Rumney Council and was later elected a councillor. On the 14th of August 1946, Churchill was invested Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, a ceremonial office with official responsibility for 5 coastal towns in southern England. Thompson was glad to have the opportunity to talk to Churchill briefly after the luncheon, but it was not until May 1948 that he made another unsuccessful attempt to seek permission to publish. Around this time, Thompson and his son Harold bought a nearby garage and worked together repairing motor vehicles and farm machinery. After talking to Christopher Johnson, a customer of the garage who happened to be a publisher, Thompson returned to work on his manuscript and dictated significant changes which were typed up by his wife Mary. In October 1951, the book was published under the title I Was Churchill's Shadow, with a dedication to Thompson's late son, Fred. Although Scotland Yard had written to Churchill informing him of the imminent publication and once again threatened to withhold Thompson's pension, this time Churchill expressed his hope that Thompson would be able to keep the pension. Thompson sent a copy of I Was Churchill's Shadow to Chartwell, and the book became a bestseller which transformed the unknown Thompson into an overnight celebrity. Since Thompson did not divulge any military secrets or anything that might jeopardize national security, the Metropolitan Police soon dropped any attempt to sanction him. While Thompson's memoirs hit the bookshelves, Churchill returned to government as Prime Minister following the general election on the 25th of October 1951. Thompson took advantage of his celebrity status by giving lectures all over the country about his time with Churchill, and after Thompson fortuitously bumped into the Prime Minister, the latter congratulated him for his success. In 1953, Thompson published a slim volume of anecdotes from his time with Churchill under the title 60 Minutes with Winston Churchill, which also sold well. Thompson's fame spread to the United States, and he and Mary went on tour in North America as a double act. The former Churchill's bodyguard, who had saved his life on numerous occasions, the latter his junior secretary, who had typed out some of his most famous speeches delivered to the nation during the darkest days of the war. The couple gave over 400 lectures in North America over 6 tours and frequently appeared on TV together, while an American edition of Thompson's first 2 books appeared under the title Assignment Churchill. By early 1956, Thompson had left Greatstone and moved with Mary to Hill Head in Hampshire. Thompson continued to invite his first wife to family occasions, and Kate and Mary were good friends who regularly called each other on the phone. Churchill resigned from the premiership in April 1955 and was succeeded by his longtime Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. Thompson continued to follow Churchill's career until his death on the 24th of January 1965. He was invited to his former boss's state funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 30th of January, and several months later visited Churchill's modest grave at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, the burial ground for members of the family near Blenheim Palace. Shortly after Churchill's death, Mary published a 4-part series in Woman magazine about her work for Churchill, but Walter's plans for her to write a book were not realized. In 1970, Walter and Mary moved to Somerset in order to be closer to Harold and Weston-super-Mare. Thompson continued to give lectures in his 80s, delivering his final one before Christmas 1977 in Wells, soon after he was diagnosed with both lung cancer and a brain tumor. On the 18th of January 1978, Walter Henry Thompson, Churchill's bodyguard, died at the age of 87. His widow, Mary, died of cancer 3 months later, and his ex-wife, Kate, the following year. Amongst the many, many books which have been written about Winston Churchill, very few mention the role of Walter H. Thompson, the man who spent more time in Churchill's presence than any other human being during the Second World War. Were it not for his association with Churchill, it is likely that he would have completely fallen out of the pages of history. When Thompson first saw Churchill at the siege of Sydney Street in 1911, he could have hardly imagined how his life would become intrinsically tied to the future Prime Minister's in years to come. During his first decade as a police officer, he had become a special branch detective and worked to protect the British government from numerous threats before being detailed as Churchill's bodyguard in 1921. During his first stint in the role in the 1920s and early 1930s, Thompson protected Churchill from Arab, Indian and Irish nationalist assassins. Although Thompson had retired from the police on the eve of the Second World War, Churchill held him in high regard, and the pair worked together for another 6 years during the Second World War. During the war, Thompson saved Churchill from German bombs during the Blitz, potentially prevented him from boarding a fatal flight, and, according to legend, even gave him the kiss of life. He travelled with Churchill all over the world as he met with Allied leaders and commanders, working with local authorities to keep his charge safe. As a consequence, few individuals were as well placed to comment on Churchill's movements during the war or to provide a first-hand account of his actions, making Thompson's writings a significant source in our understanding of the Second World War and Churchill's part in it. What do you think of Walter H. Thompson? Should his role in protecting Churchill be more widely known, or were his activities typical of the nameless bodyguards who risk their lives to protect the lives of important men and women without any recognition? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.